You're listening to Aanoodizewin, a podcast about the commercial determinants of Indigenous health. I am Bidase Kwe Nimki Beneshi Dodem Wikwem Kong Donjaba Nogo Jawaning Doda. I am Dr. Amy Shawanda. I'm a provost postdoctoral fellow at the Wakabines Institute for Indigenous Health at the University of Toronto.
My name is Daniel Eisenkraft Klein. I am a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto.
And in each episode, we sit down with experts to talk about a different health-harming industry and how it intertwines with the legacies of colonization and Indigenous health. Hi, Daniel.
Hi, Amy. All right, so I'm excited. Today we're talking about food, a personal passion of mine. Not in the scholarly sense, but I do think good food is what's kept me going through this PhD. Is food a big deal in your family?
Yeah, I would say so. In my family growing up with my siblings, I guess you can say we were food secure, and my children are also food secure. But looking at the big picture of food, our family was raised connecting food with friendship and community.
Well, that's a good segue, since we're talking about the food industry and Indigenous relationships to food today.
It is. We know that Indigenous people have a range of diet-related health issues in comparison to the general Canadian populations, with a significant higher prevalence of type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular diseases. Communities' greatest risk are rooted in a range of intersecting and combined factors, including the history of colonialism, poor access to healthy and affordable food, and an overall genetic risk for type 2 diabetes. Many of these disparities, however, can be traced to Indigenous communities' loss of traditional diets and to the residential school system. Indigenous communities' diets in the pre-colonial and earlier colonial periods largely consisted of traditional foods. These contained a variety of wild foods such as fish, game, berries, and other plants gathered off of the land. This diet was overall cost-effective, provided a range of nutrients, and served as a form of social cohesion through food preparation and sharing customs.
The legacies of colonialism, however, have significantly disrupted this way of eating, including a nutritional shift to market or store-bought foods that emphasize high-energy, nutrient-lacking foods, and shifting customary practices away from traditional food harvesting and eating. Food was also weaponized in the residential school system. Students were commonly fed scraps, and the federal government knowingly underfunded kitchens and food, leading to starvation. Residential school survivors reported a severe culture of socialization and assimilation, in which students were stripped of their identities, including in their relationships to food. So beginning in the second half of the 20th century, the loss of traditional foods has given way to a shift in dietary practices that emphasizes particularly refined and industrial formulated substances, which we often label as ultra-processed foods. The concept of ultra-processed foods refers to industrial creations of mostly inexpensive ingredients and nutrients that are manufactured using a series of processes, i.e. ultra-processed, and contain limited whole foods, if any. First Nations diets are now disproportionately made up of ultra-processed foods, with approximately 54% of Indigenous energy consumption globally coming from ultra-processed foods. This consumption is of particular concern. International health organizations, including the Pan American Health Organization and the World Health Organization, have recommended using diet's energy share of ultra-processed foods as an overall measurement of diet quality. Intersecting with and exacerbating these changes to Indigenous diets is a food industry that has been repeatedly shown to heavily push ultra-processed foods at the expense of global health. Through a range of strategies, including influencing governmental dietary advice, heavily marketing ultra-processed foods, promoting unhealthy foods in schools, lobbying policymakers, fighting efforts to promote healthy eating, and maintaining a relative monopoly over the global food system, multinational food and beverage companies have had a significant impact on our diets, particularly in terms of ultra-processed foods. Lower childhood obesity is now clearly associated with stronger regulations on sales of unhealthy foods and restrictions on food advertisements in schools. Moreover, the impacts of an overabundance of availability of ultra-processed foods and few restrictions on marketing is particularly likely to disproportionately impact marginalized communities, especially children that do not have the same abilities to critically push back at industry messaging. Researchers have found that transnational companies, such as Nestle and Coca-Cola, continue to engage in corporate social responsibility initiatives that build brand images in Indigenous communities via sponsored scholarships and employment opportunities for Indigenous youth. Yet these same industries have shown little interest in actually reducing their role in exacerbating childhood obesity-related and diet-related diseases among Indigenous communities. So with that background in mind, today we have two terrific guests whom I think really complement one another. Mélissa Mialon, a research assistant professor at Trinity College Dublin in Ireland, and a well-known expert on the food industry. and Dougie Trudeau, an Anishinaabe chef, entrepreneur, and owner of Four Winds Catering, an Indigenous food catering company.
As always, thank you and miigwech for listening to us today.
Ani Skano, Nishin Kishup, Doug Dishnakaz, Wakwimkon Donjaba. My name is Doug Trudeau. I come from Wakwimkon unceded territory in Manitoulin Island. I live here in Toronto. I just introduced myself in the language and where I come from. I'm a chef, I'm an owner, I'm a husband, I'm a father, son, everything, brother. And, really what I'm about is being a chef and an Indigenous chef and kind of really recreating, foods that were kind of taken from us and reintroducing them to the world. And, trying to help with a developing pattern of healthy eating and the foods that are kind of supplied today. And, foods from my nation, is it's kind of unique because when I met my wife, probably about 6 years ago, as much as I knew about really being Indigenous is just that my parents were. And I grew up in the city, and we were kind of under that umbrella of the whitewash and all these kind of things. And my father doesn't talk about a lot of the stuff, but my aunties do. And I know they had a very tough childhood, so I can understand why maybe my dad has never been as open with us as he's been. And since meeting my wife, and she's actually brought me back to where I come from and all these kind of things. And as a chef, it's kind of a circle for me right now. And what I mean by that is I've been 20 years as a chef in the industry. And I've made my transition over to, really focusing on Indigenous since learning from my wife and her family and all the knowledge keepers on the reserve and even her cousins with plants and medicine. And I was just like, wow, as a chef, we're always trying to reinvent and do something a little bit different. And I think it was just the right calling for me to really go back to my roots and learn. And I really like to think of myself as a student of life as well, because, we're all in this one circle. We're all start at one part and we all try to go to the next. And, when I really started diving about, the foods that we're eating in these global companies that are really, putting a scarce and, creating a lot of food insecurity for people as well, it really had me thinking. And I thought, well, maybe this is my time to really try to go back, learn, and teach as well. Because as a chef, as a parent, we're always learning and we're always teaching. I can tell you the world's changed a lot from 30 years ago. And you know what I mean? And so forth. And it's going to continue to change. So, we look at all these problems in the world right now with foods not being real. But they're creating real problems. And when I listen to faith keepers speak and knowledge keepers, they talk about, foods having a spirit. And, when you're getting tomatoes in January and February, they're injected with something. And that's what keeps them fresh. And that food has no longer a spirit. We've taken its realness out of it and we've kind of played science with it. And in doing so, you look at the health factors of children today, on reserve, off reserve, in any community. We're plagued with kids being bigger than ever, all the hormones and steroids that have gone into foods, the mental health that is created that is by that too. And, and I really think about that, about the food having no spirit anymore. And I think that is a lot that is creating a lot of these unhealthy mental issues that are plaguing a lot of the societies. And, the teachings that, were really taught to me, even as a kid, even growing up in the city, my father was still involved in the community with the Can-Am Friendship Center in Windsor, and he was the president for a little bit of time. And, I still got a little bit of teachings on there, but, the biggest thing that was taught to me was, is the gratitude for things that we have, and to really look at the foods that are here for us. They're not here to be taken advantage of with all taking more than we need. And that's the biggest problem, as leading to a lot of insecurity. As a restaurant chef, we had all these things that, presentation is always great, but we were never ever taught really about the love and the appreciation of food and the amount of waste and stuff that we could do. And I was just reading a study there a little while ago that if you collected all of the garbage out of a restaurants in the US, you would fill 5 NFL stadiums. And that is, and I'm guilty of this too. When I was a corporate chef, that strawberry's not good, garbage. Oh, that cucumber, garbage. And it just keeps adding up. And look at how many people go to bed hungry at night. It's crazy. And so some of those teachings were conflicting because this is what you were taught, but this is the world you're in. And it's hard to see the picture when you're kind of standing in the frame. Once I got out of the industry, I really just started focusing back onto my culture and my foods and the stuff that was supplied and how it was supplied. And if you look back, before pre-colonial contact, we were all buff. We were all in good shape. We all had a strict diet. And a lot of those things were, things that were within a kilometer radius. And not only did it do good for you, it did good for Mother Earth and how we created it and how we treated and how we reused the seeds. And with COVID going on, I was really nervous because you go to the grocery stores and there's nothing. And for the first time since I can remember, is that was pretty scary. Luckily enough, our family, we could survive with some hunting and some fishing and stuff like that. And coming back to one of our teachings is taking care of each other. And once again, the instructions are a little different from our brothers that came over from across the pond to kind of what we had, because they've just looked at everything as access and how do we gain from it, as opposed to us treating it with respect, almost like a relative. The fish, they're our relatives. The water, that's our relative. But it's looked at as accessibility to them, and that's really scary how it's mistreated. And I don't know what that means for how that looks for our kids in the future generation, because I live in Toronto right now. I don't even know how they're building things because there's no more land. Like they just build underground now because we've built so much up. And, you look at food now, and where are these animals going that used to be natural, free roaming? There's no such thing. And once again, these global companies have kind of taken over. And the scary part of it, I was trying to talk and teach my wife about it yesterday. We're looking at Costco chicken. Oh, yeah, $30, that's a lot. And then you look at, you go to Loblaws or and you see chicken, organic, fresh, no antibiotics, and way less protein or pieces with almost the same or higher cost. And I'm like, well, the decision is there's those companies we can't. 80% of Canadians, maybe even higher, are financially hurting. And how do you make that decision at the counter to buy 3 pieces of chicken that are mindfully way better for you because of the way it's treated versus stability and what I can do because I've got to make you got to make lemons out of lemonade constantly.
So what kind of advice do you give people in terms of eating?
What I really loved about doing and trying to teach this is eating in seasons is one of the easiest things that we could probably do for ourselves and for Mother Nature, because it's food is medicine and medicine is food, and we need to always take care of where we get the food. And if we don't do that, obviously, we could already see the state of the world, how it's been kind of going. We had an overpopulation problem in the 1950s. And here we are, 2023, I think it was 2.5 billion in the 50s. And, we're almost at 8 billion now. We have no more trees. The waters, California's out of water, and it's been out of water for years, and we can't negotiate with nature. And if you can't see these things really happening, it's, I think we're still stuck in that realm of the European contact philosophies of, no, it's not there. It's not a real thing. But we wouldn't have these problems if it really wasn't a real thing. These glaciers are melting. You look at all, Where are these animals going? Everything is becoming slowly gone. Our waters are slowly becoming more contaminated day in and day out. What does that mean for fish, which has been always a big staple? If you're from the water, you know what I mean? When you're from the water, you have access to that. And once you take that away, which has kind of already happened through colonialism, and you've already put us on the smallest parts that have the least access, the least utilization, the least stability, and the least availability of food. And now you're slowly taking that by always taking more than where you should be and not and putting anything into it. What I mean by that is, you know, simply if we buy strawberries in January, think of how many negative things that have to happen for that one thing to happen. You know, first it's got to be growing out of season, it's got to be put on a boat, or it's got to be put on a truck, and then it's got to use not natural water, not natural light from the elements that are provided for us. And here we are, 17 negative things to have one thing happen. You can't have balance like that. It's impossible. You know, you can put, it's like having 10 people on the teeter-totter and there's you on the other end. You're just sitting there, right? You're dead in the water, unfortunately. And that's the scary part. And that's why I try to, with my company, is now, how do I make like food accessible? How do I teach about food? Not only am I a chef, I'm also an educator on trying to do this and help as well. Because, you know, as I said earlier, we were buff and we knew how to eat. And the foods that were there were supplied. And the foods were stored, it was preserved, and the seeds there was always that natural cycle of harvesting. And once it was done, we moved a little bit farther for where there was more accessibility to food. You know, as an educator and a chef and as a parent, I need to try to do what's right for myself and my family as well. And that's teaching about food and how to eat, because, you know, these global corporations, you know, the worst foods that are ever been created, they're in, I bet you, 100% of our houses. And they're constantly, subconsciously even eaten. And you don't even realize what we're doing, because some of these foods and ingredients that are put in there, they're one ingredient away from like turpentine and being something as a chemical. So that's subconsciously not knowing what we're doing and what we're putting into our bodies. And that's what's hurting us. We look farther up into these communities that have these enormous colonialism prices for food. And why is that? Let's have the highest priced food with the least amount of income. That makes no sense at all. And, you know, we talk about unity and sharing, and, you know, that one dish, one spoon, and having that respect. And those were the teachings that were to me, that are kind of fallen off. And it's very difficult to get back, because, you know, we're so caught up in everything else that is unimportant. And probably the most important thing we can do is take care of ourselves. That's the best job we have. And if we don't know what we're eating, that causes a lot of turmoil, a lot of mental health, a lot of diabetes. You know, your body just doesn't act as accordingly as it should. You're tired, you're achy, and 99% of it comes down to the foods that we're eating, and the sugars, the soda, and all those unhealthy and unnatural foods is right there, because some of us don't know how to eat real food. And real food is something that's living, that's walked, flew, swam. But once again, you look at all these fish farms and all these kind of things as well, that's not very good for our waters. It's overpopulating now with such a small area. And just think of how much nasty stuff happens in that small area. You know, I'll talk about chicken for one. You know, they're kept in little battery cages, 30 to 50 in there, and they're fed all these antibiotics to keep them alive until they're slaughtered. There's nothing natural about that. There's nothing human about that. What's happening is subconsciously we're eating all these antibiotics that are in these foods that have been put in there by these global corporations to, you know, obviously make money. If a chicken's 5 pounds, let it be 5 pounds. Don't make it 15. You know, that's just being greedy. Another one of the teachings that not our philosophy, Western philosophy. So we're subconsciously eating all these antibiotics. And now we just got through a pandemic with coronavirus. And there's going to be another one when these antibiotics don't work because we're subconsciously always eating them. What I mean by that is when you get sick and you're prescribed antibiotics by a doctor, you're only supposed to take them maybe 3 to 5 days, no more. But what happens when you're subconsciously always digesting it and putting it into your body? When your body gets sick at one point and you really need those to rely on, it's not going to react the same way because you've already been taking it too much. That's another scary part where the world's kind of going. And we talk about food sovereignty a lot because it was never taught to us to do these things, because we have a Sobeys, it's dependable, it's right there. But once again, we do all this significant damage to stock those shelves, and then we just throw it away. Some gets donated to people that are hungry, sure, but it's done so much negative impact on Mother Earth that teeter-totter is not in her favor on a constant daily battle. So, these high-priced communities, they don't have the accessibility like this, like we have in the cities. And they get, my brother's way up north. My brother-in-law's way up north right now. And he was telling me it's almost, for a case of water, it's almost like $92. Like, that's insane. One of the accessibilities of essentials of life, you're paying that much for. A bag of potato chips is almost $18. So it's insane, but we get it. We don't know why, but we do. To me, it's just one of these things, like for the government stuff, it's just, I like to always call it how if they discuss it, I say they discuss it as polite colonialism still. That's just how that's how I picture they would word it. Polite colonialism. Yeah, you can have it, but you're still being charged way too much, way more than anybody else would be, just because you're lucky enough we left you that little piece of land.
And be grateful.
And be grateful, right? And you talk about health issues and, children's with suicide. The rates are insane. The lack of accessibility and the way we're still discriminated and mistreated it's I still can't believe it's a world we live in. And when my kid was talking to me about heaven and hell, do I believe in it? And I was like, well, I believe in something, but what I know of the world is something's got to be a hell of a lot better than what's kind of going on and what you see and what's been kind of just embraced, I guess, in an everyday culture, like the social media and stuff like that. Like, we forgot how to be human beings. And you can't even sit down at a dinner table without your kids or anything, or someone interruption, blah, blah, blah. Like, we've lost how to be all that connection. What does that mean for our kids and our grandkids? We're already working and paying almost double than what our parents did trying to survive. And it's not just about us, it's always about the generations in the past and the ones that are upcoming. Our leaders are doing a very bad job of thinking of our future generations, because we're still discriminated to, and we're looked at as uneducated, and we don't know more than they do. And you know what, they did get better schooling, but our schooling didn't have a classroom. Our schooling was out in the bush, listening and learning and really being grateful for everything that we do have. But we don't have that because of these things anymore, of social media. And, it's just real sad kind of how it's going.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that, Doug. That was so good. I have so many notes that I was taking as you were talking.
Mélissa, building on that, so you wrote a book, Big Food and CIE. You have pretty comprehensively and systematically investigated the food industry. Could you, just as a overarching view, as a bird's eye view, could you talk about how our food systems have evolved? That's a big question.
Yeah, and the discussion was so inspiring, Dougie. I think it's great to listen to such a way of thinking, which is very different from what we get to hear usually. And I have to say that, so I work on corporations and health. but the podcast comes at the perfect time because I am myself of African and Asian descendants. So I have that background where I live. So I live in France. My dad was French Italian, but my mom is from Mauritius. So I have a double citizenship, which is a small island on the coast of Africa. My ancestors were slaves and endangered labor from Asia. So I have that mixed background where, I have lost almost everything that my ancestors, all of that knowledge that they had. So more and more in my research, and I've just written a piece on this, a scientific publication on this, an opinion piece on coloniality in public health nutrition and how corporations are shaping, our world as it is today, and how this is the product really of coloniality, the world where we are now. If I start with that, we have two different approaches in nutrition. The one which is dominant is the one which is market-based. So, trying to sell us products. So we are consumers, in that market. And the other approach is a human right approach to nutrition, where we, everything that was just discussed, we grow our food, we eat locally, we eat minimally processed food, we have a better connection with our farmers, etc. But that is not not at all the dominant approach in public health nutrition, unfortunately. And for my work, I focus on the food industry and what we call the commercial determinants of health. So how do commercial actors, corporations are influencing our health? And we have the scientific evidence for that they are some parts of the industry are beneficial to our health, but my focus is on the harms that the industry is doing. So first, and I will try to illustrate my discussion with concrete examples from different, parts of the world where I have worked or where I work with people in those different regions. So first, you have the products themselves. We call them ultra processed foods. You have also products which are too high in sugar, salt, fat, etc. So ultra processed foods in particular are products that you would not find normally if you were cooking in your kitchen. So, using processes that you don't use, those are only used in those factories, by corporations. Ingredients as well that you won't add to your food, it's, in the form of powder. So you wouldn't use that in your own recipes. So for example, and in that, so just for the products themselves, we know those products when we consume them are making us sick, increasing the risk of developing diabetes, cancers, and all sorts of, different diseases. The crazy thing is that those products are heavily marketed to us, aggressively marketed to us, in particular to populations who have been oppressed, for a long time. So in Brazil, for example, you have boats from big food companies who are going to the Amazon, bringing those foods to those populations, which have been protected somehow. But the industry, tells us that it's for, development of those communities, they need to be modern, etc. With that excuse that they want to develop those communities, then they are bringing them with unhealthy foods that are making them sick. And it's terrible because they don't have enough protection in terms of the healthcare system. It's not so strong in those communities. So they are bringing them with and aggressively promoting those foods in those communities when the communities don't have, anything to protect themselves from unhealthy diets. Once the products are there and accepted by those populations. I am French, the French Caribbean. There were studies that have shown that in the French Caribbeans, for example, yogurts have much more sugar than the same products sold in France, in France on the continent. And this is terrible, The response from the industry was that those people in the Caribbean have a taste for sweet things, but that's not acceptable. That sugar is making them sick. Another example that was quite shocking, I used to live in Australia when I did my PhD, and a colleague told me that she found a food product that was not authorized to be sold in Australia. It was supposed to be sent in Asia, which is another big issue, but it was still sold in Aboriginal territories. So within the countries, even things that wouldn't be sold to Australians were sold to Aboriginals. So you have the products themselves, the way that they are marketed. Another example is infant formula. So infant formula, the first product that babies are fed with, and it's the majority of the population, in most countries. It started with Nestle and other companies, and there was a boycott actually against Nestle in Asia, Africa. They didn't do that in Europe, they did it at some point, but it was much more aggressive in Africa, Asia in the 1970s. These guys, their staff as nurses, they went to hospitals, publicized, made all of the marketing, and we call it medical marketing. So pretending that their products are good for the health of the babies, but then the parents of those babies didn't have safe water. They didn't have enough money when out of hospital to buy to buy those products. So they diluted the product too much and into water, which wasn't safe. So that has killed babies. Actually, it has killed babies. The aggressive marketing of the industry in those two regions of the world. And it's not, it's not something of the past. They are still doing things right now that are aggressively either marketed at indigenous communities or vulnerable populations or population reserves that have been oppressed, I would say. Those populations are not vulnerable. They are vulnerable because they've been oppressed. So in cocoa plantations, for example, right now, we have evidence for that the food industry works with children who are slaves, in those plantations, for example. I work also a lot on the political practices of the food industry. We know that the industry is using its whitewashing, coming with its corporate social responsibility initiatives, providing all sorts of things like physical activity programs or equipment for sports, and all sorts of different supports to schools, children, etc., in particular to low-income communities, just to show that they are the savior, like they are here, to protect you, to help you. So the thing is that, yes, the government, governments in many places are not there for those kids and those communities, but corporations are bridging a gap. They do that because they want to market their products to those kids. So it's just a door of entry for the industry to do that. So they will put their logos or their colors. And then how can you complain about the industry and its product when you've been helped by them, So for them, it's very important also to go to those low-income communities so that, they have your support. We had that different examples during the COVID-19 pandemic as well. It was the same. They used that, especially in low and middle income countries, going to governments saying that they will be helping the government, helping civil society organizations, etc. But that was just for them an opportunity to meet with those people, to get better connections with those people for the long term. So in the short term, they say we help you, but because they know, those people will be future customers or people who will be ally with them or wouldn't complain about what the industry is doing. And then if we take another step back, you have what I call the global drivers of the commercial determinants of health. So coloniality, as I've said, we talk about, when we talk about the history, and that's, perhaps coming back to your question, the history of the food industry. So today we have all of those ultra processed foods and all of that. If we go back in the past and look at what happened, it all started with the sugar industry, and the Dutch and English trading companies. We feel like it's a distant past, those are not the same actors, but those companies are still dominated by an elite of white, males who still have the same vision of the world, the headquarters of those companies, we call them transnationals, but it doesn't reflect the fact that those companies are based in the US, in Europe, and they have their tentacles then in other countries. So it's not really transnationals. It's from, those big countries which are dominating the world and that have their interest then pushed for, or, the vision of the world that they have is also pushed for by those food companies. So for example, you had the US at the World Health Organization or a UN discussion on breastfeeding, and the US threatened Ecuador. Ecuador, I don't know if you've heard about that one, but that one example, but they threatened Ecuador with trade sanctions and other sanctions if Ecuador was supporting a resolution on breastfeeding. And why? Because in the US, you have a lot of big companies working on infant formula, and producing infant formula. So the interest of those big countries, including the one where I live, France, are often the same as the interest of those big companies, and they work together. So the coloniality, imperialism, elitism, patriarchy, all of those questions are just not addressed at all in public health nutrition. You will barely see that discussion happening even when we talk about the commercial determinants of health. It's like, something, yes, those things happened in the past, but it's not discussed as something that is still very prominent today. It's still the issue that we are facing. So even when we talk about solutions, we could reformulate food, or, let's talk and have public-private partnership with the industry. You have the UN Sustainable Development Goals, where the industry is seen as part of the solution. All of those things which are focused on the industry, basically just ignore the fact that many of us, many people, like we've talked about farmers, women, Black people, Indigenous people, etc. We can't, and we don't want to have a seat around the table with the industry, just because we've been oppressed for so many years that we just need a different system, and it's not by, having us around the table or trying to improve the current system that this will change, the very fact that all of that is the product of coloniality. So all of those things are not taught, of course, in dietetics and nutrition, or, any health program, none that I know, or it's barely, there are some discussions, but very, very quickly. It's not, we don't have that discussion, the discussion that we need to have, because it's impacting so many people. The largest majority of people today are impacted by the products and the practices of corporations, and it's because, of the past and the connection with today, that we are in the world that we are now. So this needs to be questioned. In terms of the, solutions, I mean, we need just a different world, and we can have it. We don't want to, again, we don't want to have a space in what is already existing, because it just perpetuates the oppression that we've been facing.
Let me build on something that both of you have touched on in different ways. Doug, I think you used the term polite colonialism. You've talked about corporate social responsibility initiatives. So Amy has touched on this as well, just in private conversations, where often there's this feeling of like, why are we being so hard on these corporations when I see them doing all this good stuff for our community, right? Like they're bringing a product into our community, or they have these scholarships that they've set up. Can you touch on, both of you, where this brand loyalty, where the corporate social responsibility, where this intersects with Indigenous health? Corporate social responsibility initiatives more generally are a topic of conversation in commercial determinants research, but I think it's particularly prominent with food, because there's always this effort to maintain that positive image in a pretty concerted way, and a pretty distinct way from industries like tobacco or alcohol.
My opinion is, I don't believe they're doing much, or next to nothing, because how are they? You know what I mean? You look at Nestle, how much water they've pumped out of our reserves and everything like that, and to give I don't even know what they give back, but I can tell you it's not more than what they make. I truly believe if there was a way to connect it and make things a little bit more better, instead of putting money and giving money, how about teaching the sustainability of the food sovereignty? How to teach people how to grow their own things, to do their own stuff. But once again, the problem I see is always greed. They don't want to teach you that because you profit, they don't. That's the two worlds that we've lived in. We've come from that world of treating things with respect, unity, one dish, one spoon. We didn't have homeless in 1492. And we didn't have poverty. That stuff didn't happen until views of life changed when the Europeans came over. So it's tough for me to say, because like you could put scholarships, you could do this, but a couple people are only prospering. It's a community. And if you look at these communities, they're all related. There's a large group of a family with another group of a large family. But at the end of the day, they're all family. And if they all don't succeed and they all don't prosper, I don't believe anybody wins until I see that.
If I respond to that, I totally agree with what was just said. Just one thing, so the corporate social responsibility, all of those things that they're giving, it's often part of their marketing department. So it's under, the budget of their marketing department. So they're not doing it for nothing. They're doing it because that they know that they are making an investment in those communities. So that's the first thing. Then the second thing is that by doing that, they are capturing every aspect of our lives. In nutrition, for example, you go to a conference, there will be all of the big companies around. If you go to even in the nutrition dietetics training, you will have the industry around. If you try to do research on a topic in nutrition, the industry is here and have funded research. So they are everywhere, including capturing some elements also of our governments. The third thing is that what they're basically doing is replacing what the government should be doing, our governments should be doing. So instead of us deciding democratically, and those corporations often I have, forgotten or, didn't say that they're not paying their fair taxes. So if they really wanted to help people, they could pay more of their taxes, or at least, the taxes that they should be paying. We have evidence for that they're not paying enough, compared to us, the normal citizen. We pay much more, in comparison to what corporations are paying. So they are giving like those small, things, which is nothing compared to the profits that they are making from us, and making us sick. So they are replacing the democratic system with tokenistic solutions. So that is the big picture. We of course, it's helping some people on the ground where you receive money for your school or your sport club or when you get a scholarship. But the overall picture is that the industry, wants to capture everything and not in a democratic process. So we can't choose who gets the money for the scholarship. If it was a program from the government, then it would have been scrutinized. People could have somehow decided, in the best democratic processes. So those corporations, I've mentioned also in another discussion, B Corps. I don't know if you know B Corps. It's a new certification for companies. It started from a good thing, saying that they were doing good things for citizens, perhaps having better products, etc. But it shouldn't be the role of corporations. We have laws in place already to protect our health, and they are not respecting those laws, in many instances. So we have a democratic process. We have governments. I think we should protect that. And corporations should abide by the rules of our countries. Then if they want to do small things, they can, but first they need to respect all of that and pay their taxes and all of that. The last thing here is also that by giving us all of that money, to charities, to sports clubs, to students, etc., they are in a way silencing people, because how can you then criticize, or how can you view those corporations as doing anything wrong when you've been fed by them, not just in the by taking their food, of course, but also by receiving their money. It's it seems to be a simple winning situation when you get their money, but in fact, there are many issues behind it.
Those are some really interesting points. I know those are conversations we have. I know when I was a student, we'd have these conversations about, well, don't accept that money because this corporation did this to our community, da 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 da. And which is interesting because I'm like, well, they're still going to do that. So why can't I take the 10,000 so I can help my family and get through school so I can fight a bigger fight in the end, because these companies are still going to, it's like this whole conversation, a whole narrative. But I was taking notes too, because both you and Dougie talk about, these two worlds kind of colliding in these oppressed spaces. But one of the things I was thinking about when you were talking about marketing for ultra high processed foods, and Dougie, you can probably explain maybe a little bit more how artists, painters, beaters were promoting these companies' foods like they're cultural foods. And they're not. Like, you see beaded Pepsi earrings, you see click and KFC on paintings, and you see red rose tea, and I'm like, those Like, just go pick some plants and pick the tree and make a tea, and then we don't have to rely on these things. I know they're cheap, they're easy, they're easily accessible, but I also know that there's survival foods for our communities, but not looking at the bigger picture on how harmful these are to our health in the long run. I get it, I understand it. I mean, growing up, I didn't really have this sense of nutrition, but now that I've gotten more educated throughout and teaching my children about that, but just the whole thing with the industry sponsoring, quote unquote, that for me, it's just smoke and mirrors for assisting the communities that they oppress and continue to oppress. And they make a good shiny buck off of all of us.
Yeah, you know what? There's a couple of things that really come into mind when I think of beaters promoting and it's Pepsi. I just think subconsciously our humor has got us through so much. We know it's bad. We know we probably shouldn't be promoting it, but at the end of the day, we might get a laugh out of it, which is things that a lot of families have gone through. Is a laugh a day is probably more than anything, and it's been a very vicious cycle, obviously, through the assimilation process here. And why we do it, I don't think I have an answer. You know what I mean? Part of it, I think, is probably a little bit to have a little bit of humor, and another part of me thinks that it's just unknowingly promoting something that's bad without thinking. And it's like using the example, it could take you 30 years to build a name for yourself and you can ruin it in 5 seconds. You might not even know what you did, but I think that's kind of where I think I have a view on that, as it would be, is one is just to make a joke out of it and laugh, and two, kind of just subconsciously not really thinking about the harm it can do and promoting it. It's like a double-edged sword.
No, Amy, I was just gonna say, can you touch on beading for those who don't know what you're referring to?
Beading has been around for us for as long as it's been around, and we did that a lot for ceremonial stuff. We put it a part of our regalias, and beading is hand stitched bead by bead. And you want to talk about patience, and you want to talk about very articulate and really high crafts work. Each bead has a story, each bead has a meaning, and it has a purpose. And it's kind of just like us in this world. We all have a purpose, we all have a meaning. And when we all kind of come together, I think the tighter that beads become, we become tighter as a unity. And and I think that's about the best I can maybe do with beading, but it's been around with us in our culture for as long as I could remember. And there's some fantastic beaters out there that just make a living off just doing beautiful artwork, and seeing something coming from one bead to 6,000 beads later, pretty immaculate to get to see. You know what I mean? For me, I've never been to see the Sistine Chapel, but when I see some very beautiful beadwork, to me, I get the same kind of feeling as the Catholics would do, kind of when you go into Rome or whatever.
Yeah, there was some really interesting beadwork and painting. Like, you see these bead artists create earrings and they have cabs of KFC, or they have Pepsi or Bepsi beaded in. They're beautifully made, don't get me wrong. But then I'm also thinking, on one hand, as an Indigenous health researcher, I'm like, oh my God, they're promoting. But at the same time, I get it. It's now become part of our culture. I get it. I get why they do it. But then also, I think it's like, again, that survival. It's like the Indian taco that we have. It's so bad for us, but when it was introduced, the ingredients that were introduced to us, it was survival food. It was for us to make it another day. Like, even those foods were spoiled, but it was for us to get it through another day. And there are many artists. I'm not going to single out one artist, but I'm going to just say that these artists that create them, and they actually turn a profit because they're selling these and indigenizing these products, because they've been just become part of our community. Like, I think I can go to any of my aunties or cousins or a friend's house and they have a box of red rose tea in their cupboard. And it's so funny because I'm like, yeah, I'll have one. And it brings back memories of my grandma. So that's why I see why they're part of it. But also at the same time, it's like they're just so ingrained. They just become part into our culture and just part of us now. And I think part of it, like, this is cultural, like, we survived, we're still here, we're still making it another day, we're still a thorn to the government side, so to say. That's why I think it's become part of our culture in that sense too. It just kind of building off what Dougie had previously said.
One thing we've talked about is the tendency for individual-based strategies to address health disparities, and that goes against these industries. Mélissa, you've talked about the way industry tries to frame these debates towards the individual. When we try to talk about a neo-colonial approach, within that, there's this tendency to try to shift for Indigenous communities strategies that are community-based to the individual. So whatever the health issue, that is on the individual to address themselves, whether through personal responsibility or behavioral approaches. And that's very industry favored as an approach. And then Indigenous communities have commented on this more generally as a real departure from what traditionally communities have done. Mélissa, can you touch on those strategies and why they've tried to frame the debate in that way?
Yeah, so I mean, from the industry side, so of course, when we talk about unhealthy diet, so they won't talk about unhealthy diets, they will talk about people lacking physical activity or people not being responsible enough for their health. So, when they go to schools with nutrition programs is to teach, children how to eat better, so focusing on children specifically, but they won't tell you what I've just told you, about ultra processed foods and how those are making us sick. They won't tell the truth about their own products. So I think it's Nestle who said that 60% of their portfolio is made of unhealthy products, and they won't tell that to children, of course, because they want to be seen as, the ones who can help you get a better education on healthy diets. So we know that they are pushing for that narrative, that individuals are responsible for their health when we have clear evidence that, it's not the case at all. It's difficult to question that as individuals because, of course, it's at the end of the day, it's you who is eating, and it's difficult to realize that you've been pushed to eat in a certain way by, everything around, your culture, the marketing, etc. And often, in relation to what was just discussed, so in France, for example, and I am from a mixed background, I don't have that connection with, the culture of my ancestors. So the only connection that I have is what I see with what I see on TV, here on the radio, watch on social media, and the industry is present everywhere. So as an individual, when I think about, yes, okay, I'm not healthy, perhaps I don't eat healthily, how can I change? Then you just think about their solutions, because that's what they are promoting. You should do more sports, be more physical, physically active, eat products that have less of that, or less of that other thing, but that are still ultra processed. So that narrative is pushed everywhere, and even our governments, just repeat that. We have messages in France on TV when you have advertisements for food. You have a small message, like you should eat food with less salt, sugar, and fat, and be more active. When we know everything in our modern world is pushing us to consume those foods, so the message is not doing anything. We don't have the power to change, really. So yeah, that's my answer. I don't know if it answers your question, Daniel, or if you want me to add anything.
Well, I've heard the metaphor. It's like throwing someone into the deep ocean as waves crash over them, not giving them swimming lessons, throwing them, telling them a couple things about how to swim, and then when they start to drown.
Yeah, no, one thing that I can mention in really, you made me think about, like those big companies like Unilever, Nestle, and others, they are also the owners of weight loss companies. So of course, they want you to, lose weight and make it as if, it was an issue that, that you have, to deal with yourself. Then you go to their product and weight loss companies, instead of just, questioning the system that you are in, and, thinking that, wait, I can eat differently, to begin with, it's and not just differently by, going to the supermarket and eating the same brands, but, in smaller portions or reformulated options. No, you can just eat completely differently, but that they won't tell you, sorry.
Dougie, as an Anishinaabe chef and a chef focused on keeping Indigenous traditions alive, can you share a bit about why traditional foods are so important to you and to Indigenous communities, and how this connects to the way you've approached your own life as a chef?
Yeah, so a lot of the things that I do with my food is I work a lot with my wife's cousin. His name's Joe, and he's pretty much almost considered an elder with how much knowledge he has with plants and medicine. You know, when I go walking with him in the bush and everything like that, he'll here, taste this. This tastes minty, and you know, put it in the water and it'll be shiny. Like all these little things, and then I try to incorporate that in my food because, you know, like I said, food is medicine and medicine is food. And you know, if you're using the right things and ingredients to put into a dish, you know, not only was it natural and it was a gift for us to use and to be used in the right way. The hardest part for me about doing everything is almost forgetting everything I've ever learned as a chef, everything I've tasted as a chef. And because we have that colonial palate, when you start using things like substituting sugar and using honey, you know what I mean, as a different alternative, a lot of it comes down to trial and error because you don't know how these medicines or how these things will fuse with anything else that I'm preparing. So you know, some days I knock it out of the park and I'm like, wow, this is really good. And some days it's just, I don't know, we'll put that on the drawing board for later. You know what I mean? Something didn't go right on that time, but it's a lot of trial and error and just really trying to forget everything that was ever taught to me in my 20 years in the industry. And that's the biggest challenge. Oh, that tastes weird. Well, it tastes weird because you're not used to it. You're not used to having all that salt. You're not used to having all those sugars, butter, all those kind of things. And, you know, that's the biggest challenge I come across is, you know, finding something that is very unique that was supplied and given to us and, you know, for a purpose, and making it into something beautiful and reintroducing something that was, I just went and picked this within 100 meters and this within a, you know, I caught this in the creek and whatnot, and really trying to mix it all together to come up with something that I find is remarkably good. And I hope other people that have my food, you know, really have that as well, that same experience. And, you know, I really try to, like, for me as an ex-athlete and everything like that, like my body's ruined. Like my knees, everything is like, you know, and being a chef on my feet all day is my hips are gone. I feel like I got St. Bernard hips. So I think of things like turmeric and things like that really help as natural inflammatories, and really try to integrate that with my cooking to, you know, not only have food that tastes good, but really makes you feel good after as well.
Mélissa, do you have anything else you would like to add or any closing comments?
No, I just think that, you know, where we still have indigenous or, you know, local knowledge, I think we should protect it because we are losing everything quite quickly. And some of the things are just, you know, transmitted orally to us. So, you know, it's not written anywhere, or, you know, the things that Doug, you know, has explained, like you can't learn that in books. So where we still have people around to teach us those things, like, I think it's important for us to understand the importance of knowing those things, because that's a way to protect us from, you know, that food system that is making us sick, sorry. And at some point it will be too late, because, you know, if we lose the knowledge, you know, with languages, it's happening already. We are losing so many languages. Diversity is so important, you know, in terms of everything, you know, our languages, you know, the food, the ingredients, etc. So yeah, I think it's important to protect everything before it's too late.
Yeah, and it's pretty crazy if you look across Turtle Island as well. Like there's I don't even know how many people now are on Turtle Island, but look how many indigenous chefs there are at restaurants. There's not many, maybe a dozen, but that's just within the last couple of years. It's because, you know, a lot of that knowledge has been lost. Why is that? Is the big question. Well, we all know that answer, but you know, but you're right. It's hard to create something when it's lost. I agree with Mélissa.
Yeah, that's so interesting too. Even I taught food systems course last year at the University of Toronto, and one of them was students had no idea Indigenous chefs even existed or restaurants. And then so I encouraged them to do some research on it, and they found a couple. Only one of my students took the initiative. It was not an assignment or anything, but he was just so interested to learn about Indigenous restaurants and traditional foods. He was actually driving around Ontario trying to find traditional foods to eat. So he did find one, which is now closing, the Powwow Cafe. They're closing up their shop. And then
we were emailing each other throughout the summer, and he was asking me like, why isn't there more? Like, we need more restaurants. I'm like, well, quite frankly, you guys don't, like, the broader Canadian population doesn't seem interested in coming. It's just, we support one another. I know I'm always trying to support Indigenous entrepreneurs and the like. And so it's like, just, we're supporting each other in the community, but it's the rest of Canada that doesn't want to partake in this and supporting. And it's just really that colonial mentality of like, well, I don't need to, well, like, why should I, and things like that. It's those things that, unfortunately, where we see the slow demise of these things.
No, I'm glad we did this. It's really good to get the two of you coming at it from different angles, but having so many intersections is terrific. So that's what we were hoping for.
And thank you for doing it. I mean, it's so important. It is normalizing also those conversations. It's important.
Yeah, no, it was great to be a part of this. I was really, really pumped because I learn and I teach at the same time. And I think that the hardest part is, in the world that we live in, is we've got 2 ears and 1 mouth, but people only talk to reply. And it's one of those things that, once again, we kind of just forgot how to be human beings.
I would like to say thank you and miigwech to Dougie and Mélissa for sharing your knowledge and perspectives with us today. As I reflect on this conversation, it really encourages me to return to my ancestors and to emphasize to our listeners that it's never too late for you to reconnect with your roots and to your foods. I think the more we understand about the food industry and how it impacts our health and well-being, the more we can understand how our own relationship to food has evolved. As Dougie shared with us today, we can't negotiate with nature, and we really do need to break away from that colonization philosophy which removes the spirit from our foods. So for our listeners, I encourage you to take back those practices of your ancestors in living off the land for that reconnection to that spirit. As Dougie shared with you many times throughout this podcast today, food is medicine and medicine is our food. Thank you and miigwech again for being with us today.
This podcast is produced by Defining Moments Canada for the Bryce 100 Project, which commemorates Dr. Peter Bryce's 1922 pamphlet and his role in bringing to public attention the atrocious health conditions for Indigenous children in residential schools. In exploring the commercial determinants of health and their impacts for and on Indigenous peoples, we continue to bring public attention to the factors that impact Indigenous health.